really pleased tonight to have as a guest, as part of our speaker series, Kristina Olson. Kristina, Richard, you'll see more of her in a moment. Kristina Olson is Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Washington, where she's also the director of the TransYouth Project. It's the first large-scale, national, across the US and somewhat in Canada, longitudinal study of transgender children's development. Dr. Olson received her BA in Psychology and African and Afro-American Studies from Washington University in St. Louis. She received her MA and her PhD from Harvard University before beginning her faculty career at Yale University. And now, more recently, she moved to the University of Washington in 2013, where she comes to us from today. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the Arcus Foundation, and the Satterberg Foundation, among many others. Dr. Olson has also won several early career awards, including the Janet Taylor Spence Award for Transformational Early Career Contributions, which is from the Association for Psychological Science. She won the International Social Cognition Network's Early Career Award and the Sage Young Scholar Award. So we are very privileged and very lucky to have Dr. Kristina Olson with us here tonight. Tonight's talk is called Early Transgender Children's Development. So a brief introduction to that. Announced on our day of birth, or even months before, sex and gender are perhaps the most central categories that affect our lives, regardless of the society into which we are born. While the study of how we come to understand our own gender and the influence of gender has on our lives has been central to the study of human psychology for decades, nearly all research today has focused on people who experience typical gender identity. And in her talk, Dr. Olson will discuss recent work exploring gender development and mental health in an increasingly visible group of children, those who are transgender and non-conforming. She'll talk about how studying gender-diverse children enhances our understanding of gender and well-being more broadly, and about ongoing debates about gender-diverse children. So it's going to be a great talk. I've heard a little bit earlier today at other venues and events. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kristina Olson.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Erin, and also thank you all for coming here. I know it's weeknight, and this probably isn't a lecture hall, probably isn't where most of you hang out typically on Wednesday night, so I appreciate your taking the time to come listen to me talk, and hopefully for us to have a conversation afterwards. As Erin alluded to, I started this work actually when I came to the University of Washington in 2013, and I'm excited to have this opportunity to tell you about some of our latest findings. When I started this work, I started knowing some facts that are often discussed about transgender people, namely a lot of facts that we hear about transgender adults. For example, these are probably not new facts for most people here, that transgender adults have 8 times the likelihood of attempting suicide, are twice as likely to live on less than $10,000 a year and to be unemployed. And that stat is even more profound when you realize that transgender people are actually more likely to have gone to college than the average person. Half of transgender people report having been fired, hired, or denied promotion because they are transgender. And nearly all transgender people in this huge study reported having experienced harassment or mistreatment on the job. Further, when you ask transgender adults about their lives when they were younger, many report having had, for example, really negative experiences around their gender identity and gender non-conforming behaviors. For example, the majority report having been harassed, more than a third report having been physically assaulted, and more than 10% experience sexual violence as a result of their gender expression or identity. Further, we know that transgender teens and adults show really high rates of anxiety, depression, suicidal behavior, and ideation. So I think there's a narrative around this experience of transgender people But it seems that a lot of these experiences are qualified by family support. So, for example, we know that parental support is linked to fewer depressive symptoms amongst transgender adults. On the reverse side, being rejected by one's family is associated with more suicidality and drug use, as well as we know that broader social support is linked to lower rates of anxiety and depression. So these stats are a lot of the first stats that families of young kids that they think might possibly be transgender come across. And I think there are increasingly a number of families who see these stats and say, you know, I don't want my child to be part of those numbers. And these are parents like I'm going to use throughout my talk. This is Jazz Jennings, who is a pseudo-celebrity maybe, and certainly has been very public about her transgender identity. So I'm going to use her as an example. She's actually too old to be in my study, so I feel pretty comfortable using her as an example. But families like Jazz's have actually looked at some of these statistics and said, wait a minute, we need to try something different for our families. And these are the kinds of families that I'm going to be focusing on today. The kids that I'm going to be talking about are kids that at birth, the doctor said it was very clear. These were kids who were either boys or were girls, according to the doctor. There are, as many people might know, people for whom it's not as clear of a category. Those are individuals who we might call intersex, and that's not the group of kids that we're talking about today. These are kids where it was very clear at birth that their chromosomes and their sexual anatomy were very clear that they were a boy or a girl. But the sort of unexpected statistically thing that happened was that when they were very young, these are kids who identified very clearly as, again, in my sample, I'm focusing on kids who either identified as a girl or a boy, and that was not the thing the doctor declared the day they were born, okay? So my guess is when I present about this work that people in the audience often come to this topic with wide ranges of knowledge about this topic. So one of the first things I like to do is to play a short video to get us all kind of talking about the same thing in the same group of people. This is a video that a parent made about her family. And what I like about it is I think it shows you a lot of the perspective, at least from the parent side of things, of how things progressed in the child's life and how the parent responded to that. I also think it's quite representative of the kinds of experiences of the kids that I'm going to be talking about today. The kids may vary in terms of what ages various things happen in the video, but if you don't know anything about young transgender kids, if you can keep this video in the back of your mind while I'm presenting the data, it will present a good kind of case study to be thinking about.
"6 years ago, I gave birth to my first and only child. A boy.
Hello. I am 38. I'm 29, and I really love you.
When he was 2 years old, my son began insisting on wearing only pink clothes, preferably ones with lots of sparkles and ruffles on them.
She dresses so pretty. She really loves me. She really.
When he turned 3, he begged me to buy him some dresses and let him grow his hair long. That made the grandparents a little nervous, but we went with it.
That one's a fairy and that one's a princess.
Why is she a fairy and she's a princess?
Because fairies are magic and princesses don't. That's the difference. And also, they can't fly and they can't. Fairies fly and princesses walk.
And then one day, in a conversation that I kind of knew was coming, but it still knocked the wind out of me, my child told me that he was actually a girl, not a boy. He looked me in the eyes and told me something had gone wrong in my tummy that made him come out as a boy instead of a girl. He wanted me to put him back. He begged me to put him back, to fix this mistake. He was 3 years old. I spent the following year resisting, trying to present alternatives. I told my child over and over again that he could continue to be a boy and play with all the Barbies he wanted, and wear whatever he liked, dresses, skirts, all the sparkles money could buy. But my child said no, absolutely not. She was a girl. What are your favorite things to play with?
My princess things.
Your princess things? Why do you like princesses so much?
I just kind of do.
Do you think it's okay for boys to like princesses?
But I'm a girl.
After 12 long months of making both myself and my child miserable, I finally let my little boy go.
Goodbye. Hello! Now let's do it. Twinkle, twinkle, little star.
We switched to female pronouns and told our family and friends that she was a girl now.
Diamonds in the sky.
She wanted a new name, a girl name. At first, she picked Rainbow. I was relieved when she changed her mind and named herself after her aunt. So now I have a girl,
Talk about princesses.
a daughter.
Actually, I need to hear about how spaceships fly.
A really happy daughter. I adore my daughter. But sometimes I look at photos of my baby boy and I miss him so much. This probably sounds crazy, but sometimes I wonder where he is. It's like he was a dream I had one night, and then morning came and I woke up and he was gone. And now there's this little girl in his place, telling me that the boy was just a dream, just someone I imagined. As far as she is concerned, there never was a boy. Could you explain that to me one more time? What's the difference between you and Holly?
She has a vagina and I have a penis.
Yeah.
I'm a girl with a penis and she is a girl with a vagina.
You're a girl with a penis and she's a girl with a vagina?
Yes.
So now that I have a daughter instead of a son, what does this actually mean for her? And for me as her mother?
Pink is a mama. Pink is a mama.
Other than letting her wear pretty dresses and using different pronouns, what has actually changed? What does this newly minted girl need to know? What do I need to teach her about how to be a girl?
The girl alien does all the work while the boy alien sleeps and eats.
Do I even know how to be a girl?
The girls also have blue and purple spots.
And if a girl can be a senator or an astronaut or a plumber, if a girl can wear pants and have short hair, if a girl can even have a penis, what is a girl anyway?
Who gets to decide if you're a boy or girl?
Me!
Okay, so again, I hope that's useful for people who maybe haven't thought about the existence of transgender kids, but I also want you to kind of keep in mind that experience because I think it's pretty common to the participants I'm going to be talking about today, where maybe their parents went through a period of time where they weren't so sure about how to classify their child, and that and the participants I'm going to talk about today also, like the child in the video, actually socially transition. So now use different pronouns than they used at birth. These kids are often have been called gender pioneers, and what I think I and other people mean when we use this term is that these are kids who are kind of the first of their kind to actually be living in their gender identity as young prepubescent children. Not necessarily the first ever in the world, but certainly the first generation where there are a larger number of children living in their gender identity. Because this is kind of the first cohort of young kids, they hadn't, when we started this work, they'd never been systematically studied. There were no quantitative studies about what happens in these children's experiences. And because they have this really unique childhood, we think they will probably differ in some substantial ways from transgender teens and adults who we actually have data on, because most transgender teens and adults didn't have this early social transition. Therefore, those outcomes that I kind of led the talk with, we have no idea whether those outcomes are going to hold when we talk about these young transgender children. Okay, so a few key terms, again, probably many people in this audience are far more sophisticated in their thinking about this, but let's say that for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use the word sex to refer to the thing that the kid was declared by the doctor the day they were born. Whereas gender, here I mean something more like gender identity. This is the way the child identifies themselves. And again, the kids that I'm talking about today are going to be either they were male at birth who identified today as girls, or were female at birth and identified today as boys. These are the kids I'm going to use this term transgender to refer to. And then the final characteristic that's true of the kids I'm going to be talking about is that they went through an early social transition, which is represented by this picture here. So what we're talking about, these are prepubertal kids, which means that we're not talking about hormones, we're not talking about surgery, we're not talking about blockers. These are kids who basically cut their hair or grew out their hair, changed first names, changed pronouns, and that's what we're calling a social transition for these young kiddos. So our goal when we started this project was to just basically get some data, get some systematically collected data from these young people and their families. And we had a really wide range of questions that we wanted to answer about how their development is similar to and different from other kids, the impact of this early social transition, etc. Today I'm going to focus primarily on questions about gender development and about mental health. But first, where do our kids come from? It turns out we had to go just about anywhere we could find them. So we recruited in every way we've been able to come up with to date. And when people find out about our study, they sign up online. When there's enough people in a region, we actually fly to that region and drive individually to each family's home and meet with each family. Our goal is to do this for 20 years and to meet with each individual family every 1 to 3 years in this study. Here's a map of our American participants. The majority of our participants are American. You can see that they're in about 45 US states, and that there are a total now of about 300 children. In addition, about 2/3 are white identified, and the biggest other group are kids who identify as multiracial. In addition, we have a ratio of 2 transgender girls, so kids like in the video, for every 1 transgender boy, and I'm happy to talk about that at the end if people have questions about that. In addition, for every kid that's in our study, we're going to pretend 9-year-old Jazz is in our study, since I already told you she's actually too old. If 9-year-old Jazz was in our study, we would also have a 9-year-old girl who's cisgender, is not transgender, has no history of notable gender nonconformity, that we will follow at all the same time points. That lets us ask whether Jazz, in what ways Jazz's development is similar or different from other girls, people who identify as girls. And in addition, the closest in age sibling would participate in our research. And this allows us to think about the ways in which perhaps knowing something about transgender people might change the way you think about gender. but that you don't necessarily have to be transgender yourself. In addition, siblings obviously share the basic family environment with our transgender kids. So if there's anything quirky about the families that sign up for our research study about their transgender kids, those same quirky things are also true of their siblings. So first I wanted to make just a couple of general observations about our data that I don't have systematic data for, but the first is that our families live in a very, very wide range of circumstances in terms of social class, location, types of families, but yet it is still the case that we have a bias in our sample towards families with greater income, more parental education, and more politically liberal. That probably won't surprise people here. Those facts tend to be true of just about every research study that's done of young children, but it can add some complications to interpreting our data I'll talk about later. We also see that these are kids who showed kind of signs of gender nonconformity very early in development. Parents report that 80% of the kids showed signs by age 3, and almost all of our participants by age 4. So I know that there are plenty of transgender people who don't feel like they were trans or didn't feel that that was something that they were aware of or showing signs about that early, but our sample is. So our sample are very early identifying kids. In addition, I think the video portrayed this well. A lot of the families, I would say the most common experience of our kids is that the families allowed at least some initial, what might be perceived of as gender nonconformity. So you saw that in the video, she was like, oh yeah, you can wear dresses, that's fine. But they weren't necessarily on board for things like a social transition early in development. That said, we do have families in our study that didn't react that way. So we do have some families who said, absolutely not, that's not permitted. Can't wear a dress, boys don't wear dresses. And then we had some families who from the get-go raised their kids to be like, here's dresses. Like, do you, son, want to wear dresses? So we have quite a range, but I would say that the video is representative of kind of the most common families in our study, where they permitted some of it, but they were like, no, we're not going to transition at this early age. In addition, that while they have some family support now, right, because kids can't socially transition at these ages without parent support, our families vary a lot in terms of how much other people in their environment support their trans identity. So some of them, for example, nothing has changed in their life as a result of their social transition, and then we have other families that have lost every single family member no longer speaks to them, or the kids no longer get invited to sleepovers or parties with other kids. So we do have a wide range in the broader community support. And finally, some of our kids are very open and out about their transgender identity, and many of them are not. And sometimes that also means that, for example, their teachers and other adults in their environment don't know that they're transgender. Other times everybody knows because they go to the same school that they did last year when they had a different name and pronouns, and everyone knows that that's the same kid. So those are some kind of general observations to keep in mind while I talk about some of our data. The first area I wanted to talk a little bit about is gender development, and here we were really interested in a very simple question, which is, what does gender look like in transgender kids? Gender development is a long-studied topic within developmental psychology, and I think we have a pretty good idea of what is common for many children who are not transgender, like what do they understand at age 3 and 6 and 9, and we were curious how that would compare to our transgender kids. Sort of said simply, would these kids look a lot like kids who share their gender identity, a little bit, or more like kids who share their sex at birth, or would they maybe be less binary in their gender? So what we've done is largely take measures that already existed. Some of us at a midday meeting talked about, one of the hard things is you can't change your population and your measures at the same time. It gets confusing. So we started by just asking what happens when you ask transgender kids the same questions that the literature has typically asked for other kids. So one really clear preference that you see very early in development is that kids tend to prefer to play with same-gender peers. If you go to just about any preschool or elementary school and watch kids at recess, you see this. Not every kid, but a lot of kids prefer to play with kids of their own gender. So what happens in this task is it's very straightforward. We show pairs of kids and we ask our participants, who would you want to be friends with? And there are 6 trials, so this means that chance responding, if they were picking randomly, they would pick 3 times boys and 3 times girls. If a score is above 3, then that means kids are systematically preferring kids of their own gender. Okay, so that would mean Jazz prefers to hang out with girls or be friends with girls, and that would also mean Jazz's sister would prefer girls. I've also broken it down by age to give you a little bit of sense of the developmental trajectory here. The first thing to know is that control and sibling kids who were in 3 to 5 age range preferred to play with same gender peers. This tells us that our measure works in the way it always has in everyone else's studies, so there's nothing special about our participants here. But this allows us to ask whether transgender kids look the same or different. And here's what we find at 3 to 5. Here's our results at 6 to 8, and here's our results at 9 to 11. What you'll see is that every single age, the green bar doesn't differ significantly from the other 2. So what that means is Jazz prefers to play with female playmates or girl playmates as often as any other girl in our study. Our trans boys prefer to play with boy playmates as often as any other boy in our study. We've also looked at a variety of different stereotypic preferences. Again, these are pretty clear in the literature that kids often prefer things that their culture says are stereotypic for their gender. So here I'm just going to show you clothing preferences, but it actually doesn't matter. We've looked at lots of different kinds of preferences and we always get the results I'll show you. So here kids get to pick which outfits they like to wear. Kids actually find this really fun, and really shy kids kind of warm up to our questions by getting to pick their favorite outfits. So here 3 on this scale means that kids like the most gender neutral outfit, the kind of like jeans and t-shirt. And anything above that would mean that girls prefer stereotypically feminine clothing and boys prefer stereotypically masculine clothing. And here are our results. Again, it's very clear that our green bars never differ significantly from our other bars. And again, we see this on clothing preferences, toy preferences, and a variety of other preferences. Even actually, if they're things that the child hasn't heard of, if we make up novel things and we just tell them that some girls like this object, spoodle, and boys like tannin, we'll still see that the trans girls like the thing that they think girls like, and just as much as other girls. Okay, we've also looked a little bit at how similar kids feel to members of their gender group. And one reason we wanted to use this measure was, you might have noticed that a lot of the measures we're talking about have been very like either you like playing with boys or girls. And what we liked about this one was that kids are asked to say how similar they feel to girls, but also how similar they feel to boys. And we could actually look at a sort of different score between how much kids feel like members of their gender group versus how much they feel like the other or opposite gender here. So the basic math works out pretty easily. So a positive score here means that kids feel more similar to kids of their gender. A negative score would mean that a trans kid feels more similar to their sex at birth. And a 0 would mean that a kid feels just as similar to boys and girls. Okay, so here they have that option of feeling like they equally are boy and girl. And despite having that option, what we see at all ages here is that all groups feel more similar to their current gender than to the other or opposite gender group. Okay, so across all the measures, we've now looked at lots of different measures of identity, preferences, many more than I presented here, and we have never found one on which our transgender, our binary identified transgender kids look anything different from our control comparison groups, okay? We also have been interested in gender stereotyping. So here we used a measure that's, I guess, pretty dated now, but basically kids hear about things that are apparently stereotypes about boys or girls, and here they're asked, should only boys do the thing, should only girls do it, or should both boys and girls do it? And then there are various gender stereotypes. They're presented with 10 different stereotypes, 5 that are associated with boys, 5 that are associated with girls. Importantly, a kid, and we did have kids, could say both on everything. They could say everybody should do everything. So here I'm just going to report how many stereotypes on average kids showed. Here we just asked our 3 to 8-year-olds. Our results are that our 3 to 5-year-olds actually don't significantly differ from one another, but by 6 to 8-year-olds they do. And the pattern is that transgender kids and their siblings gender stereotype less. What this means is that transgender kids and their siblings are more likely to say everybody can do or should do gymnastics. And it's interesting here that the siblings look a lot like our transgender kids, suggesting that it's not something necessarily about being transgender that made kids more open to violating gender stereotypes, but simply maybe knowing people who are transgender or who have violated gender stereotypes in the past, that seems to make older kids at least be more tolerant of these gender stereotypes. In addition, we've looked a little bit at how much kids will accept gender nonconformity in other people. So again, this is taken from another person's research, but we ask kids, for example, if it's wrong for a boy to wear nail polish or for a girl to play with trucks, and they can say it's definitely wrong, a little okay, or definitely okay. We also ask them if they'd be willing to be friends with, for example, a boy who wears nail polish or a girl who plays with trucks. And would they like to go to school with those people? And this, unfortunately, we've only run with 6 to 8-year-olds. So the question here is, will our trans kids, they rejected stereotypes, will they also be more okay with people who violate kind of gender norms? Here, higher scores are going to mean they're more okay with these kind of violations of gender norms. And we see a similar pattern across all of them where our transgender kids significantly differ from controls in saying it's more okay to violate gender stereotypes. And you can see that the siblings usually fall with the transgender kids, but sometimes fall somewhere more in between. So this is the one area where we've seen the biggest difference between our transgender kids and our control group. Where the trans kids are more okay with gender nonconformity and think stereotypes aren't as important. The siblings typically track with our transgender kids, suggesting that one doesn't have to be transgender, but simply knowing about transgender people might change your views about gender nonconformity. Though it also could be the case that the kinds of families who support transgender kids are just different, and maybe they were to start with. That is, maybe they were open about violating gender norms, and that made them open to a child who says, this is who I am, and then maybe accepting that identity. In addition, it may be the case that families change as a result of having transgender kids, right? Or a kid. So they might have a transgender kid, and it might have since changed the way that parents talk about or think about gender, which in turn could influence how the sibling thinks about gender. Probably it's some combination of all of these, but I think it's interesting to think about these. So by and large, across our measures about gender development, what we see is that our transgender kids look pretty much identical to our control groups who are gender conforming in that they show the same degree of preferences, the same degree of identification. That's true across 3 to 12 years of age. And if anything, we see that the transgender kids are actually more likely to endorse stereotypes a bit less than our other participants and to accept those who violate gender norms. Okay, the other big topic that I wanted to talk about is mental health. For anyone who doesn't know, for a long time, actually by definition, if a child was male at birth and said, I'm a girl, that qualified a kid, more or less, to be considered as having a disorder. So there was actually something called gender identity disorder. Today it doesn't have the word disorder in it, but we still have a diagnosis, which is gender dysphoria. Also today, more and more people disagree about this being considered a disorder, and many more people think of it as one variation of human variety. What is kind of less controversial, I think, is that the literature is very clear that kids who violate stereotypes based on their sex tend on average to show high rates of anxiety and depression. That's been very clear in the literature to date. But many people have argued that, well, wait a minute, the kids in those past studies, gender nonconforming kids, transgender kids, also experience very high rates of bullying, teasing, and rejection, often from their own families, and those things could maybe contribute to anxiety and depression. The idea is that it was for a while thought that anxiety and depression were necessarily part of being transgender, and now people are saying, well, maybe it's the way they're treated that is causing people to develop anxiety and depression. So I'm going to do a quick aside on some statistics real quickly. So the way the measures I'm going to talk about are normed is that the average for the population, if you took every kid in Canada and you gave them our measures, what you would find is that the average anxiety and depression score on this scale would be 50. And scores of 63 and above would put a kid in the top 10% highest rates of anxiety and depression. So that's the top 10% you don't want to be in. And we were interested in where in this range our kids would fall on average. Some historical literature about gender nonconformity suggested kids are right around that red line, right around that 63. And so we wondered, what about these kids? These kids have parental support of their identity and are expressing that identity in their everyday life. So what would they look like? Well, first we asked parents to report on their kids' anxiety and depression, and here's what we found. In terms of depression, we found that our kids are basically perfectly average. So remember, the population average is 50, and they're at 50. In terms of anxiety, we saw that parents are reporting that kids have a bit more anxiety on average. That's significantly different than 50. But you can see it's also nowhere near that red line, remember, is at 63. So substantially better than that. We then also got data from our kids themselves, so kids that were old enough. We asked our 9 to 14-year-olds to use a similar scale and rate their own anxiety and depression. And here are those numbers. What you can see is, if anything, the kids are reporting slightly less anxiety than their parents say they have. But overall, you see the same general pattern, which is that the kids have relatively low or just normal rates of anxiety and depression. Okay, so these kids who socially transitioned are showing very good mental health, but importantly, this is very early data, and we need to have better understanding of when and why kids are some kids are doing better than others. It's really important to acknowledge, as I said at the beginning, that our families have some very unique features. Things like having more money and parental education are also correlated with often kids having better mental health. And so having access to resources might help explain some of that. Therefore, I think of this as kind of an existence proof that there are kids out there who are receiving these early supports combined with these generally supportive environments that seem to be doing quite well, suggesting that it's not inevitable that kids who are trans-identified are going to have high anxiety and depression. So I kind of think of this as what we've shown is that kids like Jazz are doing quite averagely. So in fact, I like to think of it as if you gave me data from a kid like Jazz, it would be very hard for me to tell you that it came from a child like Jazz and not from her sister. That is, most of the gender development results and the mental health results make those two children almost impossible to tell the difference of. And this one fact, that is that Jazz happened at birth to have a doctor who declared that she was a boy, is the only thing that separates her from her sister in most of our data. Okay, so as I said, this is a 20-year longitudinal study, actually we're just starting counting in 2018, so we are here in the marathon. And we have a lot of goals before we get to the end, answering a lot of questions about what these kids' identities will look like as they grow and change, and as our societies continue to change around these issues. As well as what will their well-being and mental health look like as they move into adolescence and adulthood. Now, before I finish, I want to say just a couple final few thoughts, in part inspired by several other talks I've given recently where certain things come up. So I want to be clear about what I do and don't mean in my talk. The first thing that almost always comes up, particularly if there's parents in the room, parents say like, oh, my daughter liked to dress in some boys' clothes, or my son liked to wear, quote, girls' clothes, or like to do things that I think of as girl things. Does that mean my child's trans? And I like to be very clear that we see lots of kids, and in fact, a major direction of my research group is that we're doing more and more work on kids like these kids to understand the ways in which these kids are similar and different from kids who end up identifying as transgender. Also, we need to remember that there are plenty of kids in this world who also don't necessarily feel clearly like girls and boys, and I basically ignored them completely in my talk today. These are drawings from a 9-year-old from a book that this child made that was an autobiography, and in every single page of this entire book was drawings like this, where it's very clear that this child feels half like a girl and half like a boy. And I think those experiences of kids like that are really underappreciated. The other thing that I like to point out is that people often ask me things like, is this a new Western or American or North American invention? When I was young, I never heard about transgender people, so where's this coming from? And I like to remind people that actually the concept of there being people that maybe aren't obviously boys or girls, or who have a sex at birth that differs from their gender role, exists in lots of cultures. And in fact, I stole this slide from PBS, and I like it because these are all places where Indigenous peoples have recognition that there are more than two genders in their society. So when people say, like, is this a modern American invention? I like to point out that actually we're the ones that seem to be a little bit slow in recognizing the diversity of genders that exists in the world. So with that, I just want to thank my team and open it up for questions. So thank you.